I'm Sarah McTavish from the University Waterloo History Department. I'm a PhD candidate, and today I'm going to be talking about doing historical research with archived GeoCities material and just looking at finding queer community and queer identity on GeoCities. Whoop, that is more clear. So GeoCities started as West Hollywood Internet in 1995. They offered free web hosting to anyone who wanted to start their own personal web page. You just needed a little bit of basic coding knowledge, probably Microsoft Paint from a lot of the early web pages, and anyone could create their own web page. They started off with 6 thematic neighborhoods, and these were all based on Southern California geography. So it was things like Hollywood, Sunset Strip, Rodeo Drive, West Hollywood, all reflecting, Beverly Hills Internet's own location. By the end of 1995, they had expanded to 14 neighborhoods, and this included locations like Tokyo, Vienna, and Paris. They also changed their name from Beverly Hills Internet to GeoCities, which reflects a new global outlook for the company. And I don't know what I did. Apparently I killed something. It would be me who would kill something here. There we go. I don't know either. I won't do it again. So it was during this time period that Johnny the Flower, a Russian living in South Korea, started his own personal web page. So this included pages on his favorite bands and musicians. It included a link list to softcore gay male porn. It included a Russian textbook for Koreans and a journal where he documented his dreams, his hobbies, things he liked to do. It also included a detailed biography which had his full name, the names of his family, it had his mailing address, his work email address, very personal information on this website. It was last updated in 1998, which was several months before the Internet Archive first crawled and archived this website. So the reason that this site is significant is that it was actually the 7th most linked to website on GeoCities' West Hollywood neighborhood. GeoCities, it is considered to be the early ancestor to blogs and web diaries like LiveJournal and even into today's social media. So what made GeoCities different was the fact that users were basically just given this blank slate to work with, and they decided what information was actually going to go up on these websites. And so over time, they came to create a lot of these structures and norms that we consider ubiquitous to social media. So things like the biography, the friends page, the photo page, these were all started and mediated on the personal web page. So it's significant that West Hollywood was one of the first 6 original GeoCities neighborhoods. The LGBTQ community had always been early adopters of networking technologies, going back as far as BBS and Usenet, for purposes of community formation and organizing, both political and social. So Homesteaders moved into West Hollywood quite enthusiastically, and West Hollywood expanded to 10 sub-networks very quickly. So my own work deals with the self-narrative. So I'm looking at people talking and writing about themselves on the internet. I argue that it's through this analysis of self-narrative, along with the maps then of the hyperlinks between GeoCities users, the homesteaders, that we can chart patterns of influence and interaction, which reveal this transnational queer identity, which transcends ethnicity, local language. So GeoCities was acquired by Yahoo in 1999. At that time, in 1999, it was the 3rd most visited web page on the internet. However, it was never profitable in any way. And so they kind of scaled back service over time, and finally in June of 2009, it was announced that GeoCities was going to be closed and completely deleted. And so in the few months between then and October, the Internet Archive did this one last crawl to try to archive anything that was still available on GeoCities. I think Johnny the Flower's website, this is the web crawl data for Johnny the Flower. It sort of represents a lot of the problems and the issues and the opportunities of using GeoCities as a historical source. So his site was last updated in 1998, but it wasn't crawled until 1999. And so those first few years are sort of, before the dawn of recorded time. And then we have that last crawl in 2009. We have a lot of issues with broken links, broken images, just a lot of things that didn't get archived. We also have ethical issues with dealing with this archived material that I am very aware of. I'm not sure there's a concrete solution to these issues right now. But with my own work, because of my methodology, I'm dealing with those web pages that were most frequently linked to. And so these people, the first thing that be basically public figures within the community. And so they were people who they promoted their own presence and they were trying to link to as many people as possible, bring in as much traffic as possible. And so they can be seen as highly identifiable people within the community. So for my work, I'm using Gephi, which is open source network graphing software, in order to highlight the linkages between these websites. So using a script, I was able to pull out every single hyperlink between GeoCities West Hollywood websites. And then we can make these network graphs that show how they're interconnected. So this is highlighting page rank, so basically sites that are most frequently linked to. Basically, the bigger the node, the bigger the text on this, the more frequently linked to the website was. This is actually only a small subset of the data set. There's actually 25,000 nodes on this collection, which is massively large. So this has been filtered down to 11,000 by basically removing any site that didn't link to anyone other than themselves. Still, obviously, it is massively large. It's hard to get it on one screen. It's much more useful when you can zoom in than on an actual computer and look at it in more detail. But it gives you a sense of who's linking to who, what the most relevant, maybe the most trustworthy sites in the network are, if we want to use that word. Interestingly enough, that orange and pink mass near the bottom, that's all transgender. So we can see the way that it clusters according to different themes for the websites, different individuals. So then what I do as, I'm trying to combine these visualizations with then more traditional historical close reading. So I'm going through then and looking at some of these most highly linked to websites. And so what we do see on West Hollywood is a lot of narratives, a lot of self-narratives, a lot of personal narratives, which is great for my work. We see a lot of coming out narratives, people discussing how they discovered they were queer in some way, how they came out to friends and family, how they engaged with the community. We also see narratives like this one, which is an HIV/AIDS narrative from someone who is actually extremely prevalent within both the West Hollywood community, the GeoCities West Hollywood community, and within his own community in Dallas, Texas. So he was considered a community leader. He provides this for several years. He updates his journal. And then in 2002, the site has suddenly stopped updating. So as a historian, these are the things that keep me up at night. We also see these community narratives. And so just people talking about what it's like to be queer in their own location. So what it's like there as opposed to somewhere else. These sites, because I'm looking at the most highly linked to sites in West Hollywood, most of them have some other resource. So they're a personal website, but they also provide another resource, the reason why people are linking to them in large numbers. So often this is a resource on, say, HIV/AIDS or dealing with homophobia. In this case, we have a transgender woman living in Jamaica who provides tourist resources for visiting Jamaica. So she provides links to places to stay, the tourist bureau, list of things to see and what to eat. And so when you're dealing with this collection, you're very aware of the fact that these people were writing for a global audience. So it wasn't just writing for friends or family or local community, but they had an awareness of the fact that other people around the world were reading these web pages. Another really big issue with my work is the issues of language and labeling. Labeling as a whole is incredibly important to the LGBTQ community. I mean, just for reasons of identity and community and belonging. But it becomes really interesting when we look at the interplay of this with actual language. And so at least from the most highly linked to websites on West Hollywood, we see English as the dominant language. And so, but often we see this combination of local language with English. And so sometimes, you know, the texts combine two languages, or they provide two versions of the website, in this case, English and Japanese. This becomes really fascinating when you combine it with then looking at these biographies, these self-narratives. So on this webpage, you know, somebody is writing about themselves in Portuguese. She provides a version of the page in English, which is about a third of the length of this page. But we see this quite a bit in these narratives. The use of English terms, so she uses CD, which is short for cross-dresser, in English term when writing in native language. And so we see this quite a bit, and we see the use of English as the dominant language, as a language of a labeling and identity. And I have seen, I mean, I'm still working on this collection, there seems to be global regional differences in the use of different terms. So transgender, transsexual versus other terms like cross-dresser. We see those terms being used in different ways in different parts of the world. So coming back to my network graph here, the majority of the sites that I'm looking at are their personal web pages, but the most highly linked to sites are often things like directories, webrings, and award sites. And I'm just going to look at two examples here of just really highly linked to sites that have interesting global implications. 6200 is a transgender directory of individuals. It's listed by GeoCities address, but also then by country and by US state. And so it's interesting to see just the increasing global engagement over time. So it goes from having 24 countries represented in 1997 when the site starts, and then going up to 62 by the time it was first archived in 1999. So just looking at the increasing levels of global engagement over time. The other thing I've been doing with Gephi is doing these ego networks. And so this is the other big prominent site that we see quite highly represented within the network. 1769, and this is the ego network, so all the sites that link to this site to 2 degrees. And so it's possible to see just how highly interconnected these sites are. And then again, we can go through these sites that are represented and see what's going on there. You know, do that traditional historical close reading in order to get a sense of what's really happening. And it happened again. There we go. So 1769 is actually a site called the Equality Project, which is a collection of websites that, and I'll quote here, recognize that we live in a global village and that we all, from our different social climates, our different races, our different cultures, our different sexual orientations, and our different genders, have to join together in honor of equality for all humans. Now, this is really interesting because it is explicitly inclusive of all sexual orientations, but it's located on West Hollywood. And so we see 2/3 of the 1,200 members of this site are actually listed as non-heterosexual when listing their sexual orientation. And so what we come up with when you look at that ego network and you start going through these sites that join this network, you see really a intersectional collection of websites. So people who are talking about, their own identity with, as their own, whatever, they're a person of color or language or religion or language, I said language, but really they are, but still within the LGBTQ sphere. And so we see some really interesting discussions going on in these sites. So people engaging in these issues and just giving their own narrative of what it's like to be gay or transgender or whatever they identify as, but also within another intersectional identity. We also see these discussions going on in the guest book, which I find really interesting because this is where these discussions took place during these time periods. People would post their opinions on these guest books and have discussions back and forth. And so quite often these are people that don't have their own websites, but their voices are still represented through these guest books. So just in conclusion, and some further steps from my work, the next thing I'm going to be doing is more large-scale text analysis because, again, I've only been able to read about 2% of these, as a human with a brain, 2% of these web pages of these 25,000. And so really getting into these narratives in a large scale and doing this large-scale text analysis in order to come across some of these more, these narratives and looking at how people interact with each other. Because we do see this global identity, we see this global interaction, and more than that, we see people using these global interactions in order to inform themselves of who they are. Thank you.